Lawyers, after which case did you feel like a really bad boy? Story 1. Custody battles where the child suffers. Yeah. One reason I quit doing custody cases was because I couldn't stomach it when my client clearly cared more about hurting their ex than about their child's well-being. Story 2. Feeling gross in civil practice. Civil practitioner. Someone else said it and it fits. I've felt gross, but not guilty, 2 times in 20 years that I can remember. As an associate, I represented a client of a partner several times. I can't come close to giving details, which makes this boring, but client is an industry where the business model is essentially bad deals. Even though everyone knows it, was still a "this isn't why I went to law school" situation. I had a recent client that I took very reluctantly. He was 100% correct under the law, but it was a bit of a slimy situation, essentially taking advantage of a mistake. Perhaps surprisingly, I do a lot of landlord-tenant law, mostly for landlords, and I've never felt gross about that, even though personally I've always been pro-tenant and tenants' rights. I represent a couple of property management companies who I have the highest respect for and are far from slumlords, and if they need to take action against a tenant, there's a reason for it. With off-the-street clients, I'm very picky. There are some bad tenants out there taking advantage of the system. I don't mind evicting them. Closest I came to guilt in that arena was when I had to be on site with the sheriff to serve the eviction and change the locks, and towards the end, the tenant came home with her 2 kids. I felt really damn bad for the kids, but the mom was taking huge advantage of my elderly client and hadn't paid rent for months, all the while borrowing cash from landlord who gave it to her even though she was behind. And the house was filthy. Poor kids. Story 3. Representing a monstrous abuser in eviction. I'm a legal services attorney, which is essentially a public defender but for civil issues like housing and debt collection defense. So I don't get to pick my clients. As you can imagine, I've represented quite the cast of characters. I haven't regretted winning anything, because this is what I've signed up for, and I truly believe everyone deserves legal representation when they need it. But I certainly don't love all of my clients. The worst client I had was a monstrous, wife-beating addict whose landlord was attempting to evict him after the cops came for the umpteenth time. I sympathized with the landlord and hated my asshole client, who called me an insulting name no less than 15 times. But I prevented the eviction. Story 4. Winning freedom for a sexual assault offender who reoffended. Had a client who had been convicted of sexual assault and was just finishing up his prison sentence. The state was pushing to have him declared a chronic offender and have him civilly committed after he got out of prison, but he didn't quite meet the criminal history criteria. We won on that one, but less than a month later he was arrested for assaulting a prostitute/addict. I don't regret representing him. The state should never be allowed to bend the rules on imposing a penalty as drastic as permanent civil commitment. But I do regret that the law didn't make adequate provision for dealing with guys like him. I'll also always wonder if the second victim wasn't a setup. I wonder if somebody in the county prosecutor's office didn't tell her what kind of history this guy had with teen and preteen girls, and offer her a get-out-of-jail-free card, or substances out of the evidence locker or something if she'd help stick him with a charge that would qualify him for permanent commitment. Story 5. Dismissing domestic violence cases that felt wrong. I'm a third-year law student but intern at a public defender office and hold a certificate from my state Supreme Court allowing me to practice. A lot of domestic violence cases get dismissed because the spouse recants and won't testify. After reviewing the client's file by reading the victim statement and looking at photos of women with black eyes and bruised faces, and seeing the cheerful client happy his case is over just to probably harm her again next time, I feel a bit bad. Story 6. Acquitting a credible date rape accusation. Defense attorney here. I've represented many clients in sexual assault cases. I've been lucky in that every one of them, I was either confident they were not guilty, or at the least knew there was reasonable doubt, and an acquittal was the right result. There was one client, however, when I was not. It was a date rape case where the alleged victim was highly credible in my opinion, and there was some physical evidence. I didn't want my client to even talk to me because I was afraid he would accidentally confess and limit my options if he chose to testify. Alleged victim testified, and of course came off as credible. I felt my cross was pretty ineffective too, as she answered my questions truthfully. I was fully prepared for a guilty verdict, but the jury came back with a full acquittal. I guess when you consider the evidence against the government's very high burden of reasonable doubt, it makes a little sense. But this is a prime example that winning doesn't always feel great. Story 7. Trapping a man into child support he knew wasn't his. I had a client whose boyfriend agreed to be listed as the dad on the birth certificate, despite him knowing he was not the father of the child. At the time of the birth, he swore an affidavit he was the bio dad, and it got filed by the state. Of course, he and his girlfriend broke up shortly thereafter. A few years later, he regretted his decision and no longer wanted to pay child support for a child that wasn't his. Representing the mom, I successfully made the argument that although a non-biological father could get out of paying child support in the case of fraud perpetrated by the mother as to the paternity of the child, no such defense was available to a man who voluntarily signed a birth certificate with full knowledge that he was not the father. The law was on my side, but it seemed like a pretty hefty punishment for someone who made a stupid mistake. Story 8. Evicting families after foreclosures. I do a fair number of evictions as a result of holdovers after residential foreclosures. Often entire families show up for the hearing. It gets to be where it is almost a template. Hysterical mom, stoic dad with a glint of anger in his eyes, angsty teen refusing to meet your gaze, and oblivious child/toddler, wondering why everyone looked so sad. I sit down with these people and try to be as empathetic as possible. Most of the time they try to explain that they stopped paying because they lost their job, or someone got sick. I nod and say I am sorry to hear that. Then I have to tell them that I represent the bank, and the most time I am authorized to give them is 7 days to get out, or the sheriff will come knocking. Believe it or not, most people are very polite, and even thank me after I sit and chat with them. That makes it even worse. I wish I lost every one of those cases. Conversely are the addicts and crazies who have tried to attack me or told me to leave and die in open court. I do not regret winning those cases. Edit. Tenses. Story 9. Massive judgment against a widow for medical debts. I'm going to go ahead and list my personal worst case, and the worst I've ever heard during my career. A while back, I represented credit card companies suing for outstanding debts, where we had pretty stringent client guidelines dictating how we handled lawsuits. The bottom line was that we were to be aggressive in court so as to put our client in favorable positions during any settlement negotiations. One defendant was a 40-year-old woman who had maxed out all her credit cards in a futile attempt to pay for health care for her husband, who ultimately died of cancer. In total, she had spent something along the lines of $60,000 paying for chemotherapy, hospital stays, and various other bills. She ended up losing her job, husband, and home, all within the span of 3 months. She didn't even bother showing up for hearings or responding to the complaint, meaning my client won a default judgment against her. The worst part? I had to stand up and tell the judge what my client was entitled to. $60,000 for principal amount, $80,000 for interest and late fees, $10,000 in attorney's fees. She now has a judgment of $150,000 against her. I refuse to do that line of work anymore and have made it a point to represent people against credit cards if the opportunity presents itself. Story 10. Defending a child offender and making the victim smile. The worst came from a former law professor of mine. Brace yourself, it's ugly. He was a defense attorney whose client was accused of kidnapping, assaulting, and leaving for dead a 5-year-old girl in an abandoned home. When this little girl was found, she was severely injured and was comatose. After attempting to end her life, the attacker left her in an abandoned house, believing he had succeeded. Despite the fact doctors gave her a slim chance of survival, she managed to somehow pull through. According to my professor, he knew his client had done it, and the evidence completely supported it. Despite knowing this, he put on the best defense he could muster. The prosecution ended up calling the victim to the stand, who, keep in mind, was still just a child. They gave her a direct examination cognizant of the ordeal she had been through, as well as her age. My professor then went up to cross-examine her. He grabbed a chair and sat down next to the girl in the courtroom so that he was on her level, and asked her questions in the friendliest manner possible. He smiled with her, held her hand, told her simple jokes, made her laugh. For the first time since the attack, this little girl was smiling and seemed happy. My professor was so good at building a rapport with her that she couldn't help but feel happy with him. All the while, she was too young to realize that the gentle questions he was asking were meant to impeach her credibility and undercut the prosecution's case. When the questioning was done, she returned back to her family, smiling and blissfully unaware that she had dismantled the case against her attacker. A week later, the victim and her family appeared in the courtroom on the day the verdict was to be announced. When the little girl saw my professor standing there, she ran up to him and gave him the biggest hug she could, remembering how nice he was to her. She was so happy to see him and told him thank you. A few minutes later, the story 11. Suing an elderly lady over a cat's medical bills. Right before taking my bar exam in Germany, I was working in a small law firm as a law apprentice. There was one case which was given to me, because it was considered unwinnable, but the client insisted on pushing through. The case was about an elderly lady who sold her cat, because she was too sick to take care of her. The buyer of the cat, our client, a rather wealthy lady, took the cat to the vet right after buying it. Apparently the cat needed €2,000 worth of surgeries. She hired us to collect those $2,000 from the old lady. She was really an unpleasant woman, to say at least. She acted without even the slightest bit of remorse or empathy. She knew exactly in what situation the old lady was, because she was the one who informed us about it. Nevertheless, we won the case pretty quick, even though our client didn't have a leg to stand on. Story 12. Acquitting an offender and feeling gross. Not a lawyer, but when I was a paralegal, my boss got an offender acquitted of the most serious charge of first-degree sexual assault. We had a confession he'd given to our firm's hired shrink locked in my boss's desk drawer. During the trial, the lawyer had me, at the time a woman in my 20s, sit directly beside the client so the jury could see I wasn't afraid of him. He insisted on taking the stand. During his testimony, I casually turned around to look at his wife. On her face was etched a look of horror. She, who knew him best, could tell he was lying. Up to that point, I guess she'd believed his story that the teenaged employee was just after his money. I felt so gross after that, and switched to a real estate and refinance law firm. Story 13. Prosecuting minor neglect cases that felt overblown. I used to prosecute neglect cases in a big city in America for Child Protection Services, CPS. After a few high-profile cases where young kids ended up dead at the hands of family members, CPS started asking us to file on pretty much everybody. I understand why, but I wish they would have stood up to the bad press instead of allowing it to dictate who they brought to court. From that point on, I would say about half my cases, even though a cause of action existed, I felt guilty for winning. Edit. Location removed. No thanks. Ethics Committee. Story 14. Denying pension to an employee for a minor violation. Was a labor lawyer for some time, and we had a no-exception policy against using the company credit card for personal expenses. Everyone knows you get fired for it because they beat it into you with frequent training, make you sign stuff, etc. We fired a guy who was a few months from retirement, and his union filed for arbitration. Arbitration is kind of a joke, and any labor lawyer will tell you that no arbitrator would uphold that termination, even if the guy wasn't near retirement. We won. Due to the way the pension worked, the fact he left before he reached 55 led to a massive pension discount, like hundreds of thousands of dollars. Oh, by the way, his offense was filling up his car with gas using company card because he had left his personal card somewhere and was going to run out of gas. On the other side of the coin, I had many employees do insane things like hide and sleep at work for 40 hours, lead to a 30,000-gallon gasoline spill, fighting, death threats, etc., who all got their jobs back through arbitration. Story 15. Freeing a suspected terrorist due to politics. Worked for a large law firm. We won freedom for a suspected terrorist who probably did commit a very serious atrocity, but politics got in the way of convicting him. Sorry, cannot say which case this was. Story 16. Acquitting a potential murderer. I like to see everyone have a fair trial. One case in particular that haunts me is when I was defending a guy who was being charged for the harming of a 17-year-old girl. She was drinking and smoking with her friends on a bridge, and her friends leave for a moment and arrive to her body. I got the guy who was being accused off the hook because although he was there at the scene, certain witnesses were insisting it wasn't him, and there was no DNA evidence that it could be him. The most stressful part about this case was that no one spoke up, and they ended up charging someone else instead of my guy. I don't keep contact with people in my cases for the most part for this reason, and now the parents have contacted me saying this guy that is now convicted is definitely not the guy, and he even has an alibi. Sloppy police work left many questions unanswered, and most likely, either the friends harmed and assaulted her, or they left her unconscious, and my guy the first got off the hook did it. Regardless, it's all on the friends because who would leave their friend unconscious and drunk in such a dangerous place like that? Story 17. Helping a vandal walk free on technicality. I was 14-year-old kid caught red-handed breaking about $30,000 worth of windows at a school. He walked when the prosecutor failed to observe that the vandalism statute prohibited causing damage to the property of another and neglected to introduce any evidence into the record to prove that the kid did not own the school. Everybody knows is not the same as evidence in the record. Story 18. Winning an unwinnable loan case as an intern. Many years ago, I was an intern by a lawyer. One day he gave me a case that was unwinnable according to him, but gave it to me to struggle with it. The client had received almost €70,000 on his bank account. He said it was an administrative error, but all the documents say it was a loan. I won't go into detail on how I managed to make that big amount his, because you could easily find out who he is from the details. The sad part is that I only received a coupon for €10 for DVDs. Story 19. Defending an abusive mother in custody battle. I had a client who was fighting for sole custody of her children. Her ex-husband was a wealthy businessman, and they had a prenuptial agreement, so the trial was all about the kids. She was determined to get them. The problem was, she wasn't faithful during their marriage, and the prosecutor played a tape from a private eye showing her being intimate with another person while married, which hurt her case. But I found she wasn't 18 when she signed the prenup, making it invalid. We got her a large settlement in custody, but she was a horrible mother, and their father was a good man. I immediately regretted winning, as I took the children from their loving and caring father. Story 20. Helping a DUI client avoid consequences who later died. One is a loose term, but here goes. Had a female driving under the influence DUI client who blew .293. She was early 20s, 5'7", maybe 130 pounds. On the video, she looked sober as a Quaker preacher. No balance problems, no slurred speech. A champ. The case was non-defendable due to the blow, but the state wanted a conviction and jail time because of the high blood alcohol concentration, BAC. We went with an open/blind plea to the judge and put on a hell of a case for court supervision, CS. In my state, CS keeps the conviction from entering on your criminal record and prevents your driver's license from being revoked. She literally drank herself to death within a year. Turns out she was a raging alcoholic, which is why she was so functional with such a high BAC. Losing her license wouldn't have kept her alive, but I wonder, often, if a more severe penalty, like jail, would have convinced her to get the help she needed. Story 21. Helping a client hide assets in divorce. I used to do divorces, mostly. I'm not cut out for that work. but it's the job I could get out of law school. A guy came in for a divorce and seemed, by all accounts, really nice. He claimed that they had $50,000 in cash in their safe, and that his wife had taken it out when she left the house. His ex-wife never worked, so seemed reasonable she would take the money to help pay bills, help start over, etc. 6 months in, though, when we were finalizing property, his true colors started to show. Refusing to let her have the toaster, arguing over giving her anything, even though she hadn't worked their entire 15-year marriage, telling her she could have half of the expensive plants she tended to, only if she came and got them herself. For reference, these plants were in a greenhouse, and some weighed upwards of 100 pounds each. She probably weighed 100 pounds herself, extremely meek woman in her 60s. The other lawyer and I finally get everything settled except the $50,000. My client says she took it, ex-wife says she did initially, but then put it back on the advice of her attorney. So we go to trial just on this $50,000. I cross-examine her elderly parents, treat them as hostile, really go all out. Up against a veteran attorney who had been doing this for 30-plus years while I was brand new, I had to show my worth. In the end, the judge ended up declaring that the $50,000 was quote, lost money. No one technically wins. 1 hour later, my client waltzes into the office and pays his $15,000 bill, all in $100 bills. I just stared silently at the money, while he smiled widely at me, thanked me for helping him, and then left. I quit practicing law entirely 3 months later. I still think about his ex-wife, who honestly seemed sweet and lovely, and hope she's okay. Story 22. Prosecuting innocent property owners for violations. I've definitely felt bad about wins. That came from being a municipal attorney straight out of law school and prosecuting ordinance violations. We mostly had cases against current owners of property that were upgraded without permits by prior owners. The current owners were now in trouble. If they would comply, we would drop the ticket and not charge them any fees, only in that situation. But whether they did or not, the cases felt a bit unfortunate. I once had to take a one-legged man to trial for an illegal deck. It was not the most rewarding position. Story 23. Representing a racist client in litigation. Yes! I won't go into details, but I realized my client was being racist toward the opposing party, OP. I lost sleep over the fact that I was a participant in hurting these people. Nothing overtly racist was filed. I learned all of this after the fact. I basically used the repugnant/fundamental disagreement escape hatch and got out of there. Not before giving my client a piece of my mind in a very heated phone call. I'm only human. Story 24. Contributing to a child losing contact with a parent. We need more family law attorneys who have a conscience and do the right thing. At the end of the day, we should all be about the child. A decent parent will be looking out for their child's best interests. Sometimes we disagree as to what that best interest is, and that is what court is for. Family law attorneys should not be helping destroy families. Our clients need us to counsel them to the law, which is looking out for a child's best interests and not seeking revenge on the ex. A win in custody isn't like a win in other civil matters. This is not money that we are fighting over. It is the life of a child. Our actions as custody attorneys will shape that child's entire life. In the end, your zealous advocacy played a role in a child losing a relationship with his father, so he can live in another state with, from your description, a conniving mother. You feel guilty because you have a conscience. Don't lose that. Family law needs more of that, so we can all be kinder towards each other. Edit. I have never felt guilty for winning a case. I will only accept court appointments or clients who genuinely care about the best interests of their children. I will flat out refuse a client who wants to hurt the other side. Story 25. Lawyer feels guilty after winning a case that financially ruined everyone involved. I largely agree with this. I'm a commercial litigator at a large city firm. and prefer intellectually challenging, evenly matched cases to ones which, legally, are a slam dunk for my clients. I do, however, feel regret when I suspect that we won because the other party's lawyers missed a point which could have been a game changer, or just didn't handle the case very well. I also feel dissatisfaction, if not outright regret, when the judge or arbitrator, I do a bit of arbitration too, decides in my client's favor, but based on an argument/some anterior logic which I think is incorrect, or which doesn't properly address the points at issue. Story 26. Lawyer regrets winning an appeal on technical grounds rather than merits. Agreed, absolutely. For example, I won an appeal earlier this year on preservation grounds, dubiously, and the underlying issue was both interesting and a close call. I'd be thrilled to have won on the merits, but I regret winning this way. Story 27. Lawyer feels guilty after winning a case that led to financial ruin for all parties. An ex-boss of mine has spent over 7 years litigating a relatively small case, about $300,000 in total liability. The defendants refused to settle, and their lawyer was totally inept and possibly mentally ill, filing all kinds of voluminous, 1,000-plus pages, and totally frivolous motions. He appealed every magistrate ruling to the district judge, and then tried to appeal every district judge ruling to the Federal Court of Appeals. He was even sanctioned for his conduct, which he of course appealed to the Court of Appeals. The punchline is that this was a case for unpaid wages and overtime under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, and state labor law, which provided that defendants have to pay plaintiffs' attorneys' fees. So the defendants were not only getting clocked by their attorney for all of these motions, appeals, etc., but also my ex-boss was accounting for all the time he had to spend on it. Case goes to trial. Plaintiffs win about $300,000 in damages and a whopping $600,000 in attorney's fees. Defendants appeal the jury verdict and lose, then separately appeal the fee determination and lose. Then they refuse to pay the judgment. We bring a post-judgment proceeding to overturn obvious fraudulent transfers they made after the trial, giving away their houses and other property to friends and family, etc. Midway through this procedure, they file for bankruptcy. The whole thing is just a mess for everyone. My ex-boss is basically financially ruined by this case, still waiting for, now, $800,000 plus, in attorney's fees he's probably never going to get to collect. The defendants were financially ruined by their crazy attorney, who clocked them over $300,000 in fees while ruining their lives. Their friends and family members have been drawn into the litigation over the fraudulent transfers, and they may well end up facing jail time due to fraudulent statements on their bankruptcy filings. The plaintiffs are still waiting on wages they should. Story 28. Lawyer feels bad after winning a stalking case for client. I had a misdemeanor stalking case once. Client wanted a jury trial, so we did that, and I had to question the poor girl who was getting harassed by this guy. The jury came back with a not guilty verdict, and my client turned to me and said incredulously, "They found me not guilty?" Yeah, that case. Story 29. Winning a small case that ruined everyone. An ex-boss of mine has spent over 7 years litigating a relatively small case, about $300,000 in total liability. The defendants refused to settle, and their lawyer was totally inept and possibly mentally ill, filing all kinds of voluminous, 1,000-plus pages, and totally frivolous motions. He appealed every magistrate ruling to the district judge, and then tried to appeal every district judge ruling to the Federal Court of Appeals. He was even sanctioned for his conduct, which he of course appealed to the Court of Appeals. Case goes to trial. Plaintiffs win about $300,000 in damages, and a whopping $600,000 in attorney's fees. Defendants appeal the jury verdict and lose, then separately appeal the fee determination and lose. Then they refuse to pay the judgment. We bring a post-judgment proceeding to overturn obvious fraudulent transfers they made after the trial, giving away their houses and other property to friends and family, etc. Midway through this procedure, they file for bankruptcy. The whole thing is just a mess for everyone. My ex-boss is basically financially ruined by this case, still waiting for, now $800,000 plus, in attorney's fees he's probably never going to get to collect. The defendants were financially ruined by their crazy attorney, who clocked them over $300,000 in fees while ruining their lives. Their friends and family members have been drawn into the litigation over the fraudulent transfers, and they may well end up facing jail time due to fraudulent statements on their bankruptcy filings. The plaintiffs are still waiting on wages they should have been paid almost 10 years ago. Oh, and I got laid off because my ex-boss couldn't afford to pay me anymore after all of this. So yeah, all in all, maybe it would have been better if he'd lost the case years ago. Story 30. Causing a client's deportation after win. We represented an undocumented immigrant hired by a farm that refused payment and turned him in for deportation, marking his second unauthorized re-entry, a felony. Prosecutors didn't want to pursue due to bad press, but an Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) agent waited outside. We filed a motion to dismiss on procedural grounds, and he was deported, never getting paid, which left me feeling we made the wrong choice. Story 31. Winning copyright, but no compensation. We took a copyright case to trial twice, and an appeal, winning each time on contingency. The defendant hid assets effectively, avoiding banks, and died of COVID-19, likely avoiding probate. Despite a judgment for nearly $1 million in fees, we've never been paid, throwing good money after bad, and I regret the years spent with no financial return for the client or ourselves. Story 32. Lawyer regrets, enabling vendetta in divorce. I once represented a client in a divorce case who was determined to destroy their ex-spouse financially, even though the ex-spouse had been the primary caregiver for their children and had no other income. I won, and my client got almost everything, but later I learned the ex-spouse lost their home and struggled to provide for the kids. It haunted me because I felt I enabled someone's vendetta at the expense of a family's stability. I now only take cases where the client prioritizes the well-being of everyone involved. Story 33. Custody win leads to neglected children. I won a custody case for a client who wanted full custody to punish their ex. I secured it, but afterward my client barely spent time with the kids, leaving them with grandparents most of the time. The other parent, who lost, had been more involved but couldn't afford a better lawyer. Seeing the children neglected after my victory made me question if I'd done the right thing. Now I'm more careful about the motives behind custody battles. Story 34. Custody to unfit father with drinking problem. I represented a father in a custody dispute who claimed the mother was unfit. I won, and he gained primary custody, but later I discovered he had a drinking problem, and the kids were often unsupervised. The mother, who lost, had been stable but couldn't prove it in court. I regretted winning because I realized the children ended up in a worse situation, and I couldn't shake the feeling I'd failed them. Story 35. Misused restraining order alienates kids. I won a case where my client got a restraining order against their ex, claiming abuse. After winning, I found out my client was using the order to alienate the children from the other parent, who hadn't been abusive at all. The kids suffered, losing contact with a loving parent, and I felt responsible for enabling a lie. It changed how I approach cases involving allegations of abuse now. Story 36. Divorce win destroys family business. I represented a spouse in a divorce who demanded the family business be sold to split assets. I won, and the business, which had been in the family for generations, was liquidated. Later, I learned the other spouse lost their livelihood, and the children blamed the divorce for their family's financial ruin. I regretted winning because I saw the long-term damage it caused, and now I try to mediate before escalating. Story 37. Defending child abuser and enabler wife. I was part of a team that defended a horrible sexual and physical abuser of his children. The children were willing to testify, were credible, etc. We weren't fighting for an acquittal, but instead had collateral issues we wanted to win on. The guy was going away for many lifetimes, had no chance, etc. But we tried to get his wife, who was also charged with turning a blind eye to the years of abuse, but had never actively participated in it, a deal where she got out of prison before she died. It was a horrific set of circumstances, but it was a legitimately fair deal, and it was worth fighting for on behalf of both clients. Story 38. Freeing robber who reoffended, quit after. I defended a guy that robbed a taxi driver and got him out on a technicality. The day he got out, he robbed 4 other taxi drivers and was very violent. Gave up the case after this. I also defended a guy who caused his wife's death. The prosecutor had nothing on him. He confesses to me, and I tell him that he should keep his mouth shut. He only was convicted because he didn't listen to me. 6 years later, last week, my dad was unlawfully killed, and I'm on the victim side, man. Feels bad, really bad. Story 39. Defending a fraudulent business owner. I represented a client who ran a small business and was sued for fraud by several customers who claimed he sold them faulty products knowingly. The evidence was shaky, and I managed to get the case dismissed on a technicality about improper filing. After the win, I found out he was indeed scamming people and continued after the case, bragging about how he, quote, beat the system. I felt sick knowing my work let him keep hurting others, and I now screen clients more carefully to avoid defending blatant fraud. Story 40. Winning a case that bankrupted a family. I handled a case for a client suing a family-owned restaurant for breach of contract over a catering deal gone wrong. The family couldn't afford a good lawyer, and I won a hefty judgment for my client. The restaurant had to close, and the family lost their home because of the debt. Later, I learned the breach was due to a sudden illness in the family, not malice. I felt like I'd crushed honest people for a client who just wanted money, and it made me rethink taking every case that comes my way. Story 41. Securing custody for a manipulative parent. In a custody battle, I represented a parent who seemed charming and put together, claiming the other parent was neglectful. I won sole custody for my client, but months later, I heard through mutual contacts that my client was using the kids to manipulate the ex-spouse, withholding visitation out of spite. The other parent was devastated, and the kids were caught in the middle. I felt guilty for not seeing through the act sooner, and now pushed for mediation in custody cases to avoid such outcomes. Story 42. Evicting a struggling single mom. As a landlord's attorney, I handled an eviction case against a single mom who was behind on rent. I won easily because she didn't show up to court, likely too overwhelmed working multiple jobs. After the eviction, I learned she and her young son ended up homeless, living in a shelter. My client, the landlord, didn't care and just wanted the property cleared. I felt like a tool for a system that prioritizes property over people, and it pushed me to take on more pro bono work for tenants. Story 43. Defending a hit-and-run driver. I defended a client charged with a hit-and-run that left a pedestrian with serious injuries. The prosecution's case relied on shaky eyewitness testimony, and I got the charges dropped for insufficient evidence. My client later admitted to me in private that he was drunk and did it, but felt no remorse because the guy shouldn't have been crossing there. Knowing I helped a reckless person walk free, who could hurt someone again, made me question my role in criminal defense. Story 44. Winning a case that hurt a whistleblower. I represented a company sued by a whistleblower who claimed they were fired for exposing unsafe practices. My legal strategy focused on procedural errors in the whistleblower's filing, and we won, getting the case dismissed. Later, I found out the company did have unsafe conditions, and the whistleblower lost their career and reputation. I felt like I'd helped a shady corporation silence someone trying to do the right thing, and it made me wary of corporate clients with questionable ethics. Story 45. Getting a drunk driver off on a technicality. I got a client off a DUI charge because the officer didn't properly calibrate the breathalyzer, a clear procedural error. The client was thrilled, but I later learned he was a repeat offender who crashed into a parked car a month later, thankfully with no injuries. I felt awful, knowing my win might have enabled him to keep driving dangerously, and I started focusing more on rehabilitation options for clients in similar cases. Story 46. Winning a case that screwed over employees. I represented a business owner sued by former employees for unpaid overtime. The employees had strong evidence, but I found a loophole in how they documented their hours, and the case was thrown out. After the win, my client bragged about how he always shorted workers to save money. I felt like I'd helped a greedy employer exploit honest workers, and it made me reconsider taking cases where the client's ethics don't align with mine. Story 47. Helping a client avoid taxes unfairly. I worked on a tax case where my client, a wealthy individual, hid income through offshore accounts. I successfully argued that the IRS didn't have enough evidence to prove intent, saving him millions in penalties. Afterward, he laughed about how he'd been dodging taxes for years and planned to keep doing it. I felt dirty for helping someone game the system while regular people pay their share, and I've since avoided tax evasion cases. Story 48. Winning a case that left a victim without justice. I defended a client accused of assault in a bar fight. The victim had a solid story, but I discredited their testimony by highlighting inconsistencies in their timeline. The jury acquitted my client, who later told me he started the fight on purpose because he hated the guy's attitude. The victim got no justice, and I felt like my tactics twisted the truth to let a bully walk free. It's one reason I'm more selective about criminal cases now. Story 49. Defending a fraudulent business owner. Story 50. Winning a case that bankrupted a family. I handled a case for a client suing a family-owned restaurant for breach of contract over a catering deal gone wrong. The family couldn't afford a good lawyer, and I won a hefty judgment for my client. The restaurant had to close, and the family lost their home because of the debt. Later, I learned the breach was due to a sudden illness in the family, not malice. I felt like I'd crushed honest people for a client who just wanted money, and it made me rethink taking every case that comes my way. Story 51. Securing custody for a manipulative parent. Story 52. Evicting a struggling single mom. As a landlord's attorney, I handled an eviction case against a single mom who was behind on rent. I won easily because she didn't show up to court, likely too overwhelmed working multiple jobs. After the eviction, I learned she and her young son ended up homeless, living in a shelter. My client, the landlord, didn't care, and just wanted the property cleared. I felt like a tool for a system that prioritizes property over people, and it pushed me to take on more pro bono work for tenants. Story 53. Defending a hit-and-run driver. I defended a client charged with a hit-and-run that left a pedestrian with serious injuries. The prosecution's case relied on shaky eyewitness testimony, and I got the charges dropped for insufficient evidence. My client later admitted to me in private that he was drunk and did it but felt no remorse because the guy shouldn't have been crossing there. Knowing I helped a reckless person walk free who could hurt someone again made me question my role in criminal defense. Story 54. Winning a case that hurt a whistleblower. I represented a company sued by a whistleblower who claimed they were fired for exposing unsafe practices. My legal strategy focused on procedural errors in the whistleblower's filing, and we won, getting the case dismissed. Later, I found out the company did have unsafe conditions, and the whistleblower lost their career and reputation. I felt like I'd helped a shady corporation silence someone trying to do the right thing, and it made me wary of corporate clients with questionable ethics. Story 55. Getting a drunk driver off on a technicality. I got a client off a driving under the influence DUI charge because the officer didn't properly calibrate the breathalyzer, a clear procedural error. The client was thrilled, but I later learned he was a repeat offender who crashed into a parked car a month later, thankfully with no injuries. I felt awful knowing my win might have enabled him to keep driving dangerously, and I started focusing more on rehabilitation options for clients in similar cases. Story 56. Winning a case that screwed over employees. I represented a business owner sued by former employees for unpaid overtime. The employees had strong evidence, but I found a loophole in how they documented their hours, and the case was thrown out. After the win, My client bragged about how he always shorted workers to save money. I felt like I'd helped a greedy employer exploit honest workers, and it made me reconsider taking cases where the client's ethics don't align with mine. Story 57. Helping a client avoid taxes unfairly. I worked on a tax case where my client, a wealthy individual, hid income through offshore accounts. I successfully argued that the Internal Revenue Service, IRS, didn't have enough evidence to prove intent, saving him millions in penalties. Afterward, he laughed about how he'd been dodging taxes for years and planned to keep doing it. I felt dirty for helping someone game the system while regular people pay their share, and I've since avoided tax evasion cases. Story 58. Winning a case that left a victim without justice. I defended a client accused of assault in a bar fight. The victim had a solid story, but I discredited their testimony by highlighting inconsistencies in their timeline. The jury acquitted my client, who later told me he started the fight on purpose because he, quote, hated the guy's attitude. The victim got no justice, and I felt like my tactics twisted the truth to let a bully walk free. It's one reason I'm more selective about criminal cases now. This video does not promote illegal activity. Stories are shared for commentary and education.